Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are looking into a pretty controversial figure, Chris Butler. You might know him as Siddhiswarupananda. He leads the Science of Identity Foundation.
Yeah, you might have also heard of it as IWOET or Mr. Czaitanii.
That's right, and we've got a really interesting mix of sources to work with
Oh,
here.
yeah, we do. We've got online discussions and forum posts, even some old web pages from way back when.
Oh, and even some personal accounts from people who used to be in the group. So we're basically trying to cut through all the noise, all this information, and figure out what exactly is going on with Butler and this organization.
Exactly. There's definitely a lot to untangle here.
Yeah, for sure. Even just his background is pretty interesting. He started out as a student of A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, the guy who founded ISIS-K-Con, the Hare Krishna movement.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he was actually initiated into ISKCon and everything. That's how he got the name Siddhiswarupananda. But, well, things changed.
Yeah, it seems like they had some disagreements, and Butler ended up leaving ISKCon and starting his own organization.
Which became SUF.
Right. But what I find fascinating is how SUF was in the beginning. Like, Butler adopted this super austere lifestyle.
Yeah, like living in a simple hut in Hawaii, no electricity.
Wow. Almost like he was trying to embody this idea of giving up material things and just totally focusing on spirituality.
Yeah, exactly. But then as Seth grew, so did Butler's wealth and, well, let's just say his material possessions too.
Right. And that's when things start to get a little, I don't know, complicated, because now you've got this contrast between the financial struggles that a lot of his followers were going through and, well, his increasingly luxurious lifestyle.
Definitely raises some questions, right? Like, is there some kind of disconnect between what he was teaching about detachment and, well, how he was actually living his life?
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of SIF, like their core beliefs and how they do things.
Yeah.
The big thing seems to be this idea of surrender to the guru, who in this case is Chris Butler himself.
Right, and surrender is something you'll find in a lot of spiritual traditions, but the way they talk about it in Sif, based on what we're seeing in these sources, it's a bit, well, eyebrow raising.
It's not just like respecting your teacher or following teachings,
Yeah.
right? It's more like total submission to Butler's authority.
Exactly. And the things they describe doing to reach that level of surrender, they're pretty intense, like a ton of self-criticism, and this almost like subservient attitude.
Yeah, I read somewhere that followers were encouraged to see themselves as lower than the straw in the street
Yeah.
and constantly focus on their flaws and how unworthy they were. Kind of unsettling, to be honest.
It is, especially when you consider that this extreme self-deprecation isn't something everyone in Gaudiya Vaishnavism agrees with. I mean, that's the tradition Butler's teachings are supposed to be based on.
Right, right. Which kind of brings us to this idea of sahaja, right? You gotta admit, this was new for me. What's that all about?
Okay, so Sahajiya has a couple of meanings. In one sense, it refers to specific historical sects that combined Gaudiya Vaishnavism with other philosophies and stuff. Think of it like a fusion of different spiritual approaches.
Oh, okay, I get it. Like taking different elements and creating something new.
Yeah, exactly. But within the traditional Gaudiya math lineage, Sahajiya has kind of a negative connotation. It's used to describe people who, well, they deviate from the accepted path.
So it's like a label for people who are going against tradition.
Exactly. And looking at what we have here, there's a pretty strong argument to be made that Butler's teachings, especially that intense focus on surrender and how to achieve it, could be considered Sahajiya because it doesn't really align with traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism.
And it sounds like this isn't just some theoretical debate,
Yeah.
right? There are actual consequences for the people who follow those teachings.
Yeah. That's where we get into the controversies and the allegations surrounding Butler and Seth. And let me tell you, it gets kind of messy.
Okay, so let's get into it. What are we talking about here?
Well, we already talked about Butler's lavish lifestyle and how it doesn't really match up with how many of his followers were living. But these sources go deeper. They allege some pretty serious financial exploitation going on.
Like what?
Like, there are stories about people getting fined $10 for things like serving a meal late.
Seriously, $10. That's wild.
Yeah, and it gets even crazier. There are people claiming they felt pressure to donate their businesses to Butler or just hand over their assets.
It's almost like a reverse prosperity gospel or something.
I like that, yeah. And then there are even accusations, and these are serious accusations, that Butler actually profited from some of his followers being involved in illegal activities.
Hold on, what kind of activities are we talking about?
Drug trafficking, pyramid schemes, that kind of stuff. There's even one source that names a specific follower, Patrick Bowler. Allegedly, he was involved in a global drug smuggling ring.
Whoa, okay, that definitely has a whole other layer to this. And it seems like the issues go beyond just money, too, right?
Mhm.
I mean, the sources also suggest that there was a pattern of abuse and manipulation within SIF.
Yeah, you're right. There are accounts of emotional and psychological abuse and efforts to, suppress anyone who disagreed with Butler or questioned his authority.
Yeah, and there's that one story that really stood out to me about how followers were pressured to forgive a sexual abuser within the group. It's just disturbing.
It really suggests that there might have been a culture of fear and control within Seth. Like loyalty to Butler came before anything else, even basic morals and ethics.
It's no surprise that some former members are actually calling him a cult leader.
Right. But it is important to mention that Sif completely denies all these allegations. They say Butler's a genuine spiritual teacher and that these accusations are false and malicious.
So basically, we've got these two very different narratives, right? SIF's official statements paint a very different picture of Butler and the organization than what we're seeing in these other sources.
Exactly. And it's our job to try to sort through all of this and help you, the listener, come to your own conclusions.
Okay, so that's a lot to unpack. How do we even start to make sense of all this?
Well, one way is to look for patterns and connections between all these sources. For example, all these allegations of financial exploitation, abuse, and people being silenced. It kind of hints at a pattern of control and manipulation, right?
Yeah, I see what you mean. And maybe that's where the Sahajia concept comes into play even more.
Exactly. If we look at Butler's teachings and how things were done and sift through that lens, it might help us understand how this whole dynamic could even happen.
So are you saying that this deviation from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism could be a factor in all these alleged abuses?
It's definitely worth thinking about.
And then there's this whole other aspect we haven't even touched on yet, Butler's involvement in politics. That's something that really surprised me.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. He actually started a political party called it Independence for Godly Government.
Wow, that's a pretty interesting name. And there's this guy, Rick Reed, who was basically Butler's right-hand man in all this.
Yeah, and Reed's background is something to pay attention to. He worked in the prosecutor's office, but there are also these allegations that he had ties to organized crime.
Oh, wow, that's concerning. What was going on there?
Well, it raises questions about Butler's motivations, right?
Hmm.
Was he using his spiritual authority for political gain? And what about his connection to organized crime through Reed? It's definitely something to consider.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. And this whole political thing seems to make the Sahajia debate even more complex, right?
For sure. Some people might say that Butler getting involved in politics is just another example of him straying from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism, since it usually emphasizes being detached from worldly affairs.
Speaking of worldly affairs, let's talk about Down to Earth, DTE. That's this health food store chain, and it looks like it plays a pretty big role in Butler's whole network.
Yeah, it does. We've seen stories about how Butler basically expected his followers to contribute to DTE or even give up their own businesses to it.
Which, again, brings us back to those hypocrisy accusations. You've got this supposedly renunciate guru who's super involved in business and seems to be gaining wealth through his followers.
Exactly. TTE is like a prime example of how the lines between Butler's spiritual teachings, his own personal finances, and his followers' lives all got super blurry.
And at the end of the day, it's the impact on his followers that matters the most, right?
Yeah.
We need to hear what they went through and how Butler's teachings and all of this affected their lives.
Absolutely. And that's where all those personal stories and forum posts we found become so important. They give us a look into the human side of all of this.
Okay, so what are some of the things these former members are saying?
Well, there are some really heartbreaking accounts from people who describe the emotional toll it took on them, the financial struggles they faced, and how hard it was to actually leave Seth.
I bet. It must have been incredibly tough for them.
It was. Some people talk about families being torn apart, people losing their jobs, and just the lasting psychological impact of everything they went through in Seth.
There's even mention of a specific case, Srishim, a follower who died under some pretty mysterious circumstances. Seems like there are still a lot of unanswered questions about her death.
You're right. And it's super important to remember that these are just allegations and we don't have all the facts. But these stories, they give us a real glimpse into the human cost of all these controversies around Chris Butler and Seth.
This is heavy stuff. Where do we even go from here?
I think we need to take a step back and just process everything we've learned so far. What are some of the things that stand out to you?
Honestly, I'm just struck by that contrast between how Butler presented himself in the beginning with that whole renunciation image and the allegations of financial exploitation that came later. And those claims of abuse, too. Those are really concerning.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in. And don't forget about the whole Sahajiya concept. It definitely adds another layer of complexity to all of this.
Right. It makes you wonder if these deviations from traditional Gaudiya Vaishnavism could actually have played a role in all the problems that allegedly happened within SIF.
It's definitely something to think about. And then, of course, we've got the political angle, which adds a whole other dimension to the story.
Yeah, Butler's involvement in politics raises all sorts of questions about his motivations, right?
Sure.
And if he might have blurred the lines between his spiritual authority and, well, his worldly ambitions.
For sure. It definitely complicates things. And we can't forget about those personal stories from former members. They really drive home the fact that these controversies had real world consequences for real people.
Absolutely. It's a lot to unpack. So, listener, what are you thinking? What are your initial reactions to all this? What stands out to you?
Yeah, take a moment to reflect on everything we've covered so far. What are your thoughts?
Okay, so we were just discussing those personal stories from former staff members, and some of them are really tough to hear.
Yeah, it's obvious that being part of SUF had a huge impact on a lot of people's lives. Some experienced some real difficulties, both emotionally and financially, and a lot of them even had trouble leaving.
It's like the way Seth is structured might have made it even harder to leave. That whole emphasis on complete surrender to Butler and the constant self-criticism, it doesn't really leave a lot of room for questioning things or standing up for yourself, does it?
You're right, it doesn't. And it really connects back to that sahajiya idea we were talking about. Remember how it's often used to describe going against traditional practices? Well, some people could argue that those unique parts of Seth, like how they practice surrender and the methods they used, that's sahajiya in action.
So you're saying that going against tradition might have actually created a situation where those problems were more likely to happen.
It's a possibility, yeah. And it's not just about spiritual practices either. We have to think about those financial exploitation claims too. Remember all those stories about people getting fined for small things and feeling pressured to donate their businesses? Those are pretty serious accusations.
Yeah, they are. And it really makes you wonder about Butler's lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
You have this guru who's supposedly renounced all material possessions, but he's living in luxury while some of his followers are struggling financially. It's a pretty big contrast.
That's one way to put it, and it definitely feeds into those hypocrisy accusations.
Totally. And then there's that whole political thing, which adds a whole other layer of complexity. Butler getting involved in politics, starting a party called Independence for Godly Government. It definitely raises some eyebrows. Yeah.
It does, yeah. What was he trying to do? Was he trying to mix his spiritual teachings with political ambitions? And then there's his connection to Rick Reed, his so-called right-hand man, who supposedly had ties to organized crime.
It's a lot to think about. But in the end, it's the effect this all had on Butler's followers that really matters. We can't lose sight of that. These controversies, these accusations, they had real consequences for real people.
Absolutely. And their stories are heartbreaking, but they're also really important because they give us a glimpse into what happened. They show us the human cost of these alleged abuses and make us ask some tough questions about spiritual authority and critical thinking.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. What do you think, listener? Are you starting to form your own opinions about Chris Butler and Seth? What's standing out to you so far?
Yeah, take a minute to think about everything we've discussed. What are your thoughts?
So we've really dug deep into this whole world of Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. It's been a journey.
It has, hasn't it? And we've explored so much, from Butler's early days as a student of Prabhupada, all the way to him starting SIF, the controversies, the allegations, even his political ambitions.
And of course, we've been talking about this idea of sahajiya throughout the episode, right? This concept of blending different spiritual ideas or maybe even going against tradition.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that Seth denies all the allegations against them. They say Butler's the real deal, a genuine spiritual teacher, and that all these accusations are completely false.
Right. But it's hard to ignore the sheer number of accusations and how serious they are. We've heard from former members who talk about financial exploitation, emotional abuse, feeling pressured to conform, even a culture of fear within SEF.
And those personal stories are powerful, you know. They remind us that this isn't just some abstract debate. Real people were affected by what happened, sometimes in really profound ways.
Absolutely. And when you hear about families being torn apart, people losing their jobs, the lasting psychological scars, that's serious stuff.
Yeah, and then there's the case of Sri Shim. a follower who died in really suspicious circumstances, adding another layer of tragedy to this story, with so many questions still unanswered.
It really shows that these controversies can have real-world consequences, and that the search for spiritual truth, well, it can sometimes lead people down some pretty dark paths.
So where do we go from here? What are we supposed to take away from all of this?
I think the biggest takeaway, for me at least, is that we have to be critical thinkers, especially when it comes to spiritual leaders and organizations. It's so easy to be drawn in by charisma and promises of enlightenment, but we have to ask questions, do our own research, and most importantly, trust our gut.
Absolutely. Don't just accept everything you hear at face value. Look for different perspectives, consider the evidence, and form your own opinions.
Exactly. And remember, there's a difference between being innovative and just going off the rails. Where that line is, well, that's up to each of us to figure out. This whole debate about Sajia, it's not about right or wrong. It's about understanding the complexities and making your own informed decisions.
It's true. And the story of Chris Butler and Sif also shows us that power can be misused, even spiritual power. We need to hold our leaders accountable and build safeguards to protect the vulnerable.
That's a good point. It also highlights how important it is to have a strong community and support systems outside of any one group or organization. Having healthy relationships and critical thinking skills are crucial to navigate all the complicated stuff in life, especially when it comes to spirituality and faith.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to encourage you, listener, to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for truth in a way that feels right for you. Your journey is your own.
And never forget to trust yourself, think critically, and challenge the status quo. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep on diving.